Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for being here today. It's lovely to see so many eager faces to learn about what may or may not happen in energy reform in Mexico this year. My name is Duncan Wood. I'm the director of the Mexico Institute here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. We have with us two extraordinarily talented people with us today with long experience in the energy sector and beyond in Mexican economic issues. To my immediate left is Ernesto Marcos. But by the way, for all transparency, these two people are both my friends as well, have been for a number of years. So the cronyism continues, I guess, in that sense. But Ernesto Marcos is a founding partner of Marcos y Asociados, and he has devoted most of his professional life to the financing of infrastructure projects, with a particular focus on the energy industry. From 86 to 89, he was president of Nacional Financiera. And between 1989 and 1994, Dr. Marcos was chief financial officer at Pemex. That gives him an extraordinarily privileged position to talk about many of these issues. He's a member of many different boards at the moment and has worked with a number of different international organizations. It's a great pleasure to have you with us here today, Ernesto. Juan Pardinos is the general director of the Mexican Institute for Competitiveness, IMCO. He has been a researcher at CDAC, a professor at the UNAM, at the TAM, at the London School of Economics. He's worked internationally. He's been a correspondent for CNN en Español. His PhD is from the London School of Economics. And Juan it's great to have him here today because he's able to put the question of energy reform in Mexico in a broader economic context. At this point in time, I'd like to welcome all of those who are viewing over the webcasting, and to remind people that please send us your questions through Twitter. We'd be delighted to receive any questions we can from cyberspace, as it were. To begin with, I'd just like to set the stage a little bit for our two presenters by talking a little bit about what's happening in the reform agenda in Mexico right now. As most of you in this room know, it's been an extraordinary 6 or 7 months since the Peña Nieto administration took over in December of last year. A lot of the election campaign last year in July, leading up to the July elections, was based upon the idea that things hadn't moved quickly enough in Mexico over the previous 6 to 12 years, that there was a form of legislative stagnation, a stalemate, a gridlock, as it were, and that the Fox and the Calderon administrations had failed the country in the sense that they had not been able to get structural reforms and important political reforms approved. That meant that when the new administration came into office, they felt they had an immediate mandate to engage in an ambitious reform agenda and jumped ahead very, very quickly with that. And the mechanism, as I'm sure most of you know, to do this so far has been the Pacto por México, an agreement between Mexico's main political parties, between the elites of those parties, to really move the legislative agenda ahead. And if we see what the priorities have been for this legislature up to this point, and the incredible achievements that have been made, we see, from labor, education, telecoms, right now a financial reform. These have been not just reforms that have gone through the legislature with a majority, but these have been constitutional reforms. So it's important to state that at this point in time, because it means that not only have you managed to get a majority, but you've managed to get at least a 2/3 majority. And that really highlights how successful the Pacto por México has been up to this point. The two reforms that are really outstanding, the financial reform is not yet finalized, but we expect it to go through. The two outstanding reforms that will be dealt with in the fall of this year are energy and fiscal reform. And depending on who you speak to, people will say that energy is la madre de todas las reformas. Some people will say that the fiscal reform is the most important of the reforms because that will sort out state finances. But the fact is that these two reforms are obviously very, very closely interlinked with each other. And that really gives us an idea of how important these two reforms that are pending for the second half of the year are. And they're important not just for state finances, they're important not just for their impact upon the economy, they're important, of course, in very political terms. As we will discuss in a little while, these are questions which hold the potential to drive a serious wedge between the major political parties in Mexico. Let me talk a little bit about the question of energy as a prominent issue as it has emerged since the beginning of this government. In fact, Enrique Peña Nieto has been talking about the need for an urgent and ambitious energy reform since he really became the candidate for the PRI back in the end of 2011. And what's extraordinary, I think, and really differentiates this period of time from the previous energy reform back in 2008 is that everybody now recognizes there is a need for change. Going back to 2008, there was a serious split in Mexican political elites between those people who said, no, we can continue going on the way we're going because we have lots of oil under the ground, because we have a national oil company which has the potential to do it. We just need to make a few small changes. This time around, everybody recognizes that there are fundamental changes that are needed, and that's a positive departure point. But there isn't the consensus, however, on what those changes are, and that's really what makes this interesting, of course. I would say that just as in 2008, this time around, the media, both national and international, has played a crucial role in establishing the issue as the prominent reform that really needs to be out there. It's intriguing to see how for the last 6 to 12 months, every single day in the Mexican press, there's a story about energy reform, about the need for reform, just as back in 2007, 2008, before the previous round of reforms, the Mexican press was full of stories about the impending, looming crisis for Pemex and for national oil and gas production. The present government has used the international stage as a way of messaging about the importance of energy reform in a way that the previous administration of Felipe Calderon didn't. A lot of the major and most important statements that have come out about the need for reform have actually taken place either here in Washington, in New York, in London, in Berlin. Things are said internationally that aren't necessarily said on home territory, which I find an intriguing angle of this. And of course, the best example of that is what the president said this week on his international tours, basically coming out and saying that there is a need for production sharing agreements to enable Pemex and the country to move ahead with the energy sector. A little word about the Pacto por Mexico for those of you who are not familiar with it. I see that the Pacto por Mexico has really been, as I said, the funnel through which all major legislative initiatives have had to pass in order to be approved. And we see that there are three factors there that have made this possible. First of all has been Peña Nieto's ability to marshal unity within his own party. It's quite remarkable when you see how the PRI has changed over the past 6 months from the situation we were at sort of 3-4 years ago. The PRI is really a united party in a way that many people doubted. Going back to July of last year, people wondered whether the new president and the new leadership of the party would be able to unite what's always been a catch-all umbrella party of diverse interests, of the so-called dinosaurs versus the new cadre of priistas. And what we've seen is that there is extraordinary unity within the party, highlighted by, of course, the National Convention of the PRI a few months ago, in which the party rallied around the figure of the president, Enrique Peña Nieto, and came to significant agreements that allow the party now to move ahead with crucial questions such as energy reform, and of course the question of applying value-added tax to food and medicine, which will be crucially important for the fiscal reform. The second factor is, of course, the PRI's relations with other parties. And the PRI's relations with other parties, a lot of people doubted that the PRI would be able to actually pull this off. Given the way in which the PRI had posed a significant obstacle to the PAN over the past 6 to 12 years, whenever the PAN wanted to move forward with a major structural reform, the PRI played along for a while and eventually said, no, we're not ready to do that and we're not willing to actually give you the reforms that you need. And there was a feeling that perhaps there would be a tit-for-tat going on, that the PAN would not play ball with the PRI, and that the PRD would seek to block a lot of the reforms. And the Pacto por Mexico has been so successful because that hasn't taken place. And the reason why that hasn't taken place, I asked this question the other day to a Mexican senator who said that she believes it really has been the leadership of the presidency not just the president as an individual, but of Presidencia as an office, that has really been crucial in pulling the parties together and to making sure that each of the major parties feels as though they're getting something out of the deal and that it's in their interest as well as the national interest. And the last factor, which I think is crucial in understanding the Pacto por Mexico, and in particular the future of the Pacto por Mexico, is the question of unity within the other parties. As many of you will be aware, both the PRD and the PAN are at this point in time going through a period of great uncertainty. The PAN because there is a major split within the party, and the PRD because there is an impending split within the party with the creation of the Morena social movement that will become a party under the leadership of Andrés Manuel López Obrador. And as we were discussing just outside a few moments ago, this impending split within the left in Mexico is something which is making the PRD think very carefully about how they deal with an issue as politically sensitive and controversial as energy reform. A quick look at the distribution of votes within the legislative houses in Mexico, and you can see over here on my right, the large sort of dark gray block is the pre-votes. If you add together the Green Party and the PANAL Party, you get very, very close to 50% in the Senate. Over here, you get to 50%, in fact, 50% plus one in the Chamber of Deputies, so they're immediate allies. That gets you to sort of the ability to very easily pass legislation. But in order to get your constitutional reform, you have to have your 67%. But so if you add in the PAN, which is this sort of grayish-green block here of 30% in the Senate and 23% in the Chamber of Deputies, you get to that. And that's why, at this point in time, I think that it's the PAN that is the major question that we have to be asking. How is the PAN going to play ball or not with the government? And how united is the PAN going to be at this stage in time? So we see a very simplified version of what I just said. The PRI is united, the PAN is in disarray right now, and we're waiting to see how that is resolved, and the PRD has an impending split. Those seem to me to be the most important political factors at this point in time in understanding how all of this is going to shake out. That's my introduction. I'm going to now set the stage, I hope, for Ernesto to come in and tell us why the reform is actually needed. So I'll pass the microphone over to you, my friend.
Thank you, Duncan. Thank you for your kind invitation. I'm very happy to be here and participate in this discussion, which I think it's very timely because the stage is set for a national debate. We're actually having a debate, although not as open as you would see from Washington. But I thought it was convenient to go through some facts, some numbers that talk about recent trends and official projections for the oil and gas industry, and then the areas of opportunity and the issues that are being discussed in the debate. Well, you know this story. Reserves have been falling for really 20 years. These are the last 12 years. And it's only recently, it's only in 2011 and 2012 that a replacement rate of 100% has been achieved. Proven reserves are the most affected, although there have been recent discoveries announced in Mexico, particularly Trion and Supremus, which are deep water wells that were drilled in the very close to the border with the U.S. In the Perdido Fault Belt, and Cuna, together with Lakach, which was discovered a few years back, which is a gas reserve also in deep water. There have been also some discoveries inland. Production, as you all know, reached a peak in 2004 when Cantarell, the supergigantic field that gave Mexico over 1 million barrels a day for more than 20 years, and then a nitrogen injection project was implemented, and the production of Cantarell, which is part of the marine, Northeast Marine region, reached 2.4 million barrels per day. One single field was responsible for over 60% of total oil production. The production has fallen over 800,000 barrels a day, but Kumalov Sab, which is a field also in the Northeast Marine region, has compensated partly the steep decline in Cantarell. Now, Kumalov Sab represents 1/3 of national oil production, and Cantarell has almost disappeared. From 2,400,000 barrels per day in 2004, it is producing today around 300,000. Gas is a different story. It went up at the beginning of this last decade, but only momentarily, as Duncan, in the British interpretation of the world, would say. When you're traveling in the U.S. and the captain says we're going to be airborne momentarily, if you interpret it the British way, it's only for a moment. If you understand the U.S. way, it will be for a long time. But this was the British interpretation of momentarily. So natural gas went down recently, and that is mainly because of fiscal incentives. The tax rate for gas is so high today that with current prices, and prices of gas have fallen in all of North America because of the shale revolution, and that doesn't make production of gas in Mexico profitable. The main region for the production of gas is Burgos, the area of Burgos in the northern part of the country. It's basically the same Texas fields that extend over the geographic border. Here is a story of what has happened in terms of capital expenditure. The efforts of the Mexican government to compensate the decline in Cantarell have been enormous. As you know, as you see, the average capex for Pemex over the first 10 years of this decade was $11.8 billion in E&P. It has been increased to 22 billion, more than 22 billion. And it is projected to stay more or less at that same level. But the difference here, I think 2013 is a very good example to look at, because the business plan of Pemex was talking about a $25 billion total capex, and they were authorized 100% of what they required in E&P, but only 2.5 billion for downstream. I don't know if you are aware of this, but several years ago, 5 years ago, a big expansion of refinery capacity was announced for a new plant in Tula, a new refinery in Tula. And according to the plan in Pemex, they were supposed to start building that refinery this year. And that's why the investment in downstream was projected to be this high. Well, it was reduced to 1/3 of what was requested, simply because putting money into refinery is really destroying value. There is no value in generating additional refinery capacity with the capacity that you have in the U.S. still available, and the cost of that investment. So this increase in capex, which is now this is the official CENER projection that they have to present to Congress every 2 years. Between the low and the high case scenario is basically the same. They pretend to sustain a level of investment that would allow production of oil and gas up to 3 million barrels per day by the end of this administration. This is a a challenge according to many analysts, but this is the official projection. The Tula expansion is the one that I was just referring to, that has been announced, but it has not been authorized in terms of budget appropriation. So if Tula is not built, refining capacity for Mexico would still be below 1.5 million barrels per day. The balance of natural gas is very similar. Today, in 2012, last year, Mexico imported from the U.S. basically 2.2 BCF of natural gas. You see how the deficit is growing. And in the projection, in the official projection by CENER, even the low case scenario would require shale gas to begin generating product, and the official projection calls for fields that have not been discovered yet to contribute to that scenario. You know, this is why during the last administration, Congress, who has to look at this official projection by CENER, did not authorize the projections because they thought, or they considered that it was not fundamented. It was not related to a selection of fields that they had already discovered and were trying to develop into production. This is why the balance of gasoline is always in a deficit. Mexico imports around half of the total national consumption of gasoline because the capacity inside Mexico has not been able to cover more than 50% of national demand. And according to the projection, even in the most optimistic projection, we would still be importing over half of the total demand for gasoline. The diesel balance is much better, but gasoline today is 50% in deficit. But now let's see the perspective, the long-term perspective. This is an official assessment by Pemex of total capacity long-term. The cumulative production accumulated over the last century or even more, since oil was beginning to exploit in Mexico. It's 53.7 billion barrels of oil equivalent. Reserves 1 to 3P are what you can see here. But prospective resources, according to Pemex, this is the Pemex's official evaluation, are still as large as cumulative production for conventional, and this includes deep water. Mexico has not been able to produce one single barrel of oil from deep water, although there is a very significant investment program being developed in exploration. And the official estimation of Pemex for non-conventional is around 60 billion. I have to say that the Energy Agency Administration from the Energy Department here has a significantly larger estimation for resources. So the opportunities are in deep water. This is the activity that has been concentrated in the shallow water up to now of the southern part of the Gulf of Mexico. This is the border, the international border negotiated with the U.S., and this is where the Trion, Supremos, and Maximino, which was announced only recently, a couple of months ago, has been discovered. This is the area where, with some degree of probability, trans-border resources would be developed. And the other area of great opportunity, as you all know, is shale plays. I'm only graphing here the area that is very close to the border with the U.S. in the Eagle Ford formation in the Texas border. This is the border here. And Pemex has been asked to assess the potential of shale gas and oil in Mexico. I have expressed personally an opinion that Pemex should not get involved in shale plays because they do not have the capacity, the operational capabilities, the technology, and the resources to do that. And this is what I think it's a big opportunity for a concessionary regime. The official program of Pemex is that they are now hiring service companies, international service companies, Halliburton, Schlumberger, this type of companies, to develop what they call field laboratories. They are going to be assigned 5 areas in the Eagle Ford formation in Mexico to drill and assess the potential of this area. So I finally get to the issues of the debate for the energy reform. I have classified this in three pillars of policies. One has to do with Pemex, what to do with Pemex, how to operate the national oil company. One has to do with regulatory capacity by the Mexican state. The other one is liberalization for private investment participation in the sector, and one that crosses that goes across the 3 pillars is the development of a local industry, which we have not done properly. Here I use the Pacto por Mexico agreements. This is number 54. Obviously, it is the general assumption that Pemex will maintain the property. The Mexican state will maintain property and control over the development of hydrocarbon resources. Nobody discusses this, although those who oppose the reform are always talking about privatization of Pemex. And this is this was the reaction this week after the announcement of the president in London. What to do with Pemex? Pemex has to be transformed into a company, into an enterprise, not a government agency. That is stated by the Pacto in agreement number 55. But it doesn't talk about doing away with the monopoly. It is also said that the Pemex corporate board has to be independent to provide autonomy of operation, but it does not say anything about alliances. You know, the authority to negotiate alliances and go into production sharing contracts. There is nothing said about the labor contract, which is one of the main issues of the reform. Then the strengthening of the regulatory capacity in the National Hydrocarbon Commission, that is also stated in Pacto agreement number 58. And then as far as liberalization, the only thing that is mentioned in the Pacto and has been agreed with the 3 political forces, large political forces, is to promote downstream competition. You know, that's as far as the Pacto goes. It does not state in favor of a concessions regime as the one that exists in mining. You know, the same argument of national property over resources, hydrocarbons or minerals should apply. And it doesn't say anything about price controls. Now, what would be the structure of the industry if a deep reform with constitutional amendments is attained? The Mexican state would maintain mineral ownership, capture the economic rent through a tax regime, and the control and ownership of Pemex as the main issues. Pemex would preserve exclusive rights over conventional land or shallow water resources. But there are two scenarios for the constitutional reform. One that would only allow alliances of Pemex with private investors, private operators, and this would be this would require constitutional reform, but would involve Pemex in all elements of the industry, perhaps with some risk contracts for mature fields and production sharing contracts for deep water. By the way, it is not politically correct to talk about production sharing, so they are talking about profit sharing contracts. And in the case that the constitutional amendment goes all the way to allow for a concession regime, shale plays would be obviously the opportunity, and the downstream, including processing and transportation distribution. The last graph is an estimation we did at our own office of what additional private investment could be generated with a constitutional reform like the one described. And according to our own numbers, we just went by sectors, how many fields in the deep water, for example, could be developed in the next few years. We assume that 4 new fields could be developed of around $6 billion each, and that's how we came with the figures here. The same for shale gas and other petrochemicals and other infrastructure investments. The conclusion is that Pemex investment represents a little over 2% of GDP today, and you could expect at least to double that amount with another 2 or 2.5% of GDP of additional private investment. Thank you.
Perfect timing. In fact, you came in at 19 minutes, so that was incredible. Well done. Juan, the microphone is yours.
Muchas gracias, Duncan. Thank you very much for the opportunity to share the work we do at IMCO. Well, I was not invited here to talk about guns, but I'm going to start with a kind of political incorrect reflection. Like, each country has its own confusions. And I use the example of guns because it might resonate for the American public. I don't want to share my intimate views on it. But for the rest of the world, it's kind of complex to understand why in the US you have this confusion between freedom and the right of use of guns. In Mexico, we also have our own confusions. For example, we have the confusion between our national sovereignty and a chemical molecule. The last time I checked the national flag, there were no chemical molecules on the Mexican flag. But we do behave as if they were. So when you see the institutional design of the Mexican oil sector is all based in this confusion. And the confusion goes even further. We have the confusion between the Mexican flag and the chemical molecule of oil. Then we have the confusion of the oil and the company that it's in charge of taking the oil from underneath the water and underneath the land. So the biggest challenge for whatever happens in the next months in Mexico, it's to take a big red crayon and draw a line between the molecule, the industry, and the flag, which is going to prove very complex and politically challenged. It's going to be a huge political challenge, but it's something that needs to happen in Mexico. Under this framework, in IMCO, we have an internal conversation of how we could contribute to address the Mexican public of how big the confusion was in the global context, and how this Mexican singularity was hurting the prospects of development and prosperity of the whole country. And the way to do it is we start looking at the world map and finding countries which have national energy industries as Mexico does. And the way they kind of combine competition, private investment, with a national oil industry. And we find a lot of surprises on the way. One slide that I would love to have here that I found yesterday, even the logo of Pemex, the corporate logo of Pemex, has 3 colors: red, white, and green. I don't know if you have seen these colors somewhere else. So the confusion really goes deep down into even the corporate entity of the company itself. So we start looking at different kind of institutional arrangements in the world to share it with the Mexican public and see what we could learn from it. So let's start with a global outlook that in Mexico is still not permeating in the national discussion what's happening here in the US. And I think that's one of the biggest contributions that the US could make to the reform in Mexico. It simply put forward more information about the energy revolution that it's happening in the US. The fact that in the next years, we have a pointer here, North America would pass from being the 3rd to the 1st region of producing hydrocarbon energy in the world. That's a complete game changer for, it's a new global order for the energy sector. And in Mexico, we haven't still digest this new information, which should be just by itself, leaving aside our own absurdities and confusions, just by itself should be the first trigger to reform our own energy sector, but we haven't discussed it, and it's not in the media, and it's not in the wider public knowledge. Then the US, it's on its way. There's a huge possibility that in the next few years, the US could achieve energy independence. Even the skeptics that says that the US would not achieve energy independence, for example, the recent ExxonMobil report, they say that it's not going to be because lack of hydrocarbon resources, but lack of engineers, that the US would not have enough human capital to bring all the oil beneath its territory. So we have to keep this in mind in order to promote the reform in Mexico. The human capital, it's a huge challenge also that we have kind of left behind in the discussion. Just Schlumberger in 2011 have 540 patents. The Instituto Mexicano del Petróleo had just 22, of which 16 are registered in the US. So now the energy sector, it's a kind of human capital sector. There's this saying that oil is in the mind of the people. It's not it not just depends of how much oil is beneath the surface. It's which people have enough human capital to take it from there. So this is an additional challenge that Mexico has. The international lessons. In this column, you will see companies owned by government and the kind of flexible possibilities they have for joint ventures in exploration and production and private investment downstream. And the only place in the world that you will find that has a double no, it's Pemex. It's Mexico. So a few months ago, Emilio Lozoya, the chairman of Pemex, made a public statement that Mexico and North Korea were the closest energy sectors in the world. So we start finding out information about the North Korean oil sector. There's not much to research there, but we found one South Korean professor in a university that wrote one paper on energy in North Korea. And we found that the North Korean government has licensed to Australian companies exploration of oil, and it hasn't become famous or of high notoriety because they didn't find any. But that proved that North Korea has a much more flexible energy kind of market and institutional design than Mexico. Not for saying Cuba, that it's also here, where is Cupet. which, if you look at the level of production of Cuba, it's irrelevant for the global energy markets. But the issue is which kind of institutional design they have for competition and private investment to promote energy. So from Saudi Arabia, for example, we learned that downstream, not upstream, because that's still all controlled by Saudi Aramco, Saudi Arabia has a possibility of domestic joint ventures, international joint ventures, which Mexico doesn't have. Cuba, the example I wanted to give, it's a map of the different wells that have been distributed to companies from Vietnam, from Brazil, from Venezuela, from India, from Angola, from China, from Russia. So when Fidel Castro starts teaching you lessons of how the market economy works, then you're in deep trouble. No? You know it's time to change. And this is what's happening. Cuba right now has a much more flexible investment environment in energy. Basically, they didn't have an energy sector, and they understood the only way was to open to the world, bring the technology they couldn't produce, and that's what they have been doing for the past decade. Brazil, it's an example of what Mexico shouldn't do in a way. This is the Petrobras share. This line is where they, at the time when they found the big pre-sal resource, and what the stock in Petrobras is in NASDAQ has gone from about $60 around August 2005, or a bit in the summer of 2005, to less than 10 in February 2013. So it shows how, even if you have a lot of resources, if you don't manage your energy well, if you don't open the sector to technology, to sharing information and technology with other companies, if you want to do it everything by yourself, this is what happened to wealth creation in the modern energy sector. That's the stock of Petrobras. Even they have a lot of resources underneath. They have been very successful finding them, but the investment decisions that they have made are not particularly the wisest ones. One example regarding what Ernesto said, that for Mexico wouldn't be the very clever decision to construct this refinery in Tula. The worst investment in the history of the energy sector has been done by Petrobras recently. It's a refinery called Acevedo Lima, I think it's in the state of Pernambuco. It originally, the cost of the project originally in 2004 was $4 billion. And it was expected to open 6 years later, around 2010. Now it's not been opened. It's expected to be to open around 2015 or 16, and the total cost is $20 billion. And it's far from the markets it wants to serve. It's possibly the worst investment ever made in the energy sector. I think one of the best decisions of Felipe Calderón government was not to build this refinery in Tula and start making excuses of not doing it. Hopefully, the government of Enrique Peña Nieto would not pursue this investment. Lessons from Norway, which is other country which was a national oil industry. You see here in red the percentage of oil revenue as GDP, how it's going up, and the total oil revenue. And the most intriguing part here is that Norway doesn't have, its oil resources are declining, but Statoil has learned so much from its technology that it's now digging wells in other regions of the world. It's a very successful company by itself, and the only way they have done it is through sharing information and doing joint venture with other companies. This graph that was shown to me by someone that worked in Statoil, it's very interesting because this red line is what had happened to the proven reserves of Norway if Statoil would have not gone with joint ventures. So this is the billion of barrels of equivalent oil of proven resources of Norway. And this is how it has gone, how it would have been without any joint ventures. And here you see what happened with different joint ventures of different companies and how the reserves of Norway have been increased thanks to the partnership with different companies. This is what, in a way, what we should do in Mexico, find different and flexible schemes to bring companies which have the technology, have the vision, that they could work with Pemex or even by themselves, resolving the confusion that the company that brings the oil, it's not the same that the oil itself, no? Colombia, it's also a very interesting example for the Mexican case. This is the share of total output by Ecopetrol. It's 36% of the total outcome of total output of oil. And the most intriguing part of Colombia, I think, and the biggest lesson from Colombia, is that they created an oil sector, an energy sector, which, if you see Mexico, we have a monopsony and an entity que es un organismo descentralizado. I really don't know how you could translate that in English, but it's a government entity that it's there, but it's not a sector. The companies that service Pemex are just a few very privileged contractors, but the only place an energy engineer could work in Mexico is in Pemex. So you don't have this kind of healthy ecosystem of competition and diversity that has been created in Colombia with all these companies extracting oil. So there you have a sector, there you have competition, there you have diversity, not a single monopsony ruling over all the business related with hydrocarbons, which has been very unhealthy for the economy. One consequence of this is that now the Bogota market, the stock market in Colombia, it's the second biggest in South America after Sao Paulo. It has surpassed the one in Buenos Aires, in good part thanks to the way the Argentinian economy has been conducting itself, but also because the new companies that have joined the Bogota stock market thanks to the openness of the energy sector. This is Ecopetrol compared with Petrobras stock. So if you see, it would be much more wiser to invest in Ecopetrol than in Petrobras. And one of the reasons is that in Colombia, you have a much more open and competitive market there. These are the different schemes that each country has for concessions, production sharing, and risk service regarding the ownership of the molecule, the investment, and the compensation. And these are kind of menus of options that Mexico has. We are not innovating. It's not kind of nuclear physics. It's something that has been done in other countries with a national oil companies. And these are the kind of possibilities we have. This is the value chain: exploration, transformation, transport of marketing, and in different countries, how it's distributed among different companies and the possibility they have to invest. And we see that in Mexico, it's the only country which one single company goes through the whole production chain from upstream to downstream. So we don't have strong competition at any link of the process of the energy sector. Even Cuba, which is here, has much more competition in exploration and production that Mexico has. Also, these state-owned companies participate in other markets, in other regions, extracting oil from different parts of the world. The Iran, which is on a very strict economic embargo, has more developed more links with the world than Pemex. Pemex has an embargo built by its own, an own-sponsored embargo, which has isolated the company from the rest of the world. But you see China, Saudi Arabia, Colombia, for example, it's in Peru, Brazil, and the United States. For the Mexican framework of mind, it's really mind-blowing to see a state-owned company, for example, Petrobras or Ecopetrol, drilling wells in US waters in the Gulf of Mexico. It really breaks our hard drive. How it's possible that a state-owned company from one country is drilling on the waters of the US? Well, that's how an open market works. And that's what we need to see, and we need to communicate in Mexico in order to draw these thick red lines between our national pride, our energy industry, and the wealth of the hydrocarbon sector that should remain in the hands of the nation. This graph shows just like the level of absurdity that we have. It's just a theoretical model of the cumulative profitability of the investment portfolio in Pemex and the cumulative investment portfolio. And I'm sure Ernesto would be quite familiar with the model, because the way decisions are done in Pemex, you need to invest in the projects that deliver the highest profitability. If not, you would even be committing an illegal act, no? Because you have to maximize the level of profitability of the use of public resources. So you start with the projects that have the highest level of profitability. But then there are some projects which are very profitable, especially in the gas sector, but not as profitable as the others. And then you cannot invest in them because you don't have the possibility that private sector will invest in them. And then from the public sector, you cannot invest in them because you have to raise higher profitability from the others. And what happens is that no one is investing here. So we have forbidden investment and forbid wealth creation in the energy sector. It's the numbers of the subsidiaries in Pemex. The most intriguing one is refining, which lost basically 140 billion pesos in 2011. That's losing $10 billion a year for a national-owned company. If you look just as Pemex from the refinery part, it's a huge black hole of taking public resources, and we still keep on thinking that this is the way to go. It's really quite intriguing. And also, one of the big challenges we have, and one of the big reforms that should have been happened and has not happened, is simply have better infrastructure to connect the US gas sector with the Mexican industry. One of the biggest absurdities of the last year is that we are paying gas at the same prices, in some places of Mexico, that China is paying. If at Henry Hub, the prices are around $4 per million of BTU, we are paying it to $16, even $18, which is affecting not just the competitiveness of the Mexican energy sector, but of the whole export industry. So just one huge big reform is build enough infrastructure to bring gas cheaply from the US into the Mexican industry. And this is more related to the competitiveness of the whole Mexican economy, and I would even say of the whole North American region, and not just of the energy sector. Like for years, the Mexican lawmakers have thought, how do we create higher walls in order to prevent foreigners to come and take our oil? Now we should start thinking how we tear those walls down in order to take the oil of our neighbors and foreigners and be better partners in the energy sector. Thank you very much.
Thank you to both of our ponentes here today for terrific and detailed presentations. Before launching into the first round of questions and discussion, I'd like to actually invite Joe Duckert, if you wouldn't mind commenting very briefly about what you see as being the impact of this on the United States energy sector. It's a conversation that we've had over the years here. I remember 3 years ago we had a conversation in this very room about what Mexico's impending oil crisis would mean for the United States. And things have moved on very fast since then. So that as both Juan and Ernesto have pointed out, the United States doesn't actually need Mexican oil in the way that it did 3 to 5 years ago. I wonder if you'd like to comment, Joe.
I'm not sure I can comment briefly. It has been at least 18 months since I have tried to figure out what Peña Nieto had in mind in his promise to reform the Mexican oil and gas industry. And I've learned more today about what he might have in mind than I have over the past 18 months. So I hope the slides will be posted on the website. I think these have been two very valuable presentations. I'm also a well-known optimist about the outlook for not just U.S.-Mexican cooperation in energy and environment, but North American cooperation. And so I have to make my comments in the context of North America. And because Duncan did warn me that he was going to ask me this, I have made some notes, but they will be rather scattered. First of all, the U.S. relations, the U.S. government's relations with Mexican energy depend to a very large extent politically on its relations with Canada. And our governmental relations with Canada are tied to this long-delayed decision on the Keystone Pipeline. And I think that we have not quite matched, but tried to compete with the ineptness of the way we've handled Keystone by the way the White House and to some extent the Congress has delayed action on the agreement between Patricia Espinosa and Hillary Clinton, which took place about 18 months ago, which would have involved joint development of hydrocarbon resources that straddle the boundary in the Gulf of Mexico between the United States and Mexico. Now, this agreement, which was ratified promptly by the Mexican Senate, by the Mexican Congress, actually, has brought no actual action in the U.S. Congress. I heard Lisa Murkowski, who is the ranking minority member of the U.S. Senate Energy and Commerce Committee, say the other day, and you can pretty well vouch for the fact that when Lisa Murkowski speaks, Ron Wyden, who is actually the chairman of the committee, is going to agree. She also was frustrated by the fact that there hasn't been any action on our part. What would it mean? The U.S. news media is just beginning to understand what the importance of that agreement is. It would unitize fields. It would do what has been done in the United States for many, many decades. It would permit joint development by more than one party, in this case, Pemex plus perhaps an assortment of companies authorized by the United States, to develop areas that are considered potentially rich in hydrocarbons. And it would decide in advance, subject to further negotiation, the split, 60-40 U.S., 60-40 Mexico. But then, no matter where the wells were actually drilled, if they produced, the split of profits would be according to the basic agreement. Now, that sort of thing could be applied to Eagle Ford. I agree completely with the idea that Pemex should not try to develop shale gas on its own. But I think that it could and should use as a springboard the transboundary agreement in the Gulf of Mexico to a similar agreement on natural gas crossing the U.S.-Mexican land border. Now, that takes a certain amount of dexterity, but the Mexican government has, on occasion, shown similar agility in interpreting words. Remember when certain strategic products of Pemex were ruled off bounds to private involvement? And what the government did at that time was simply define the word, change the definition of the word strategic. I think that there is a great opportunity now, but the United States government, by and large, I'm talking about the White House, I guess, and most of the Congress doesn't understand how important it is to retain as a serious partner, to the extent that we can make it so, Mexico as well as Canada. And I think encouraging a North American outlook, while it might seem a diversion at this time, I think is terrifically is going to be terrifically valuable in the long run. Now, why am I still optimistic, apart from my basic nature? Long ago, I used the example of the movement toward recognition, acceptance, and implementation of North American energy cooperation as a ratchet. We may move forward a little bit, but once we move forward, it's impossible to slip back. And so I think whatever comes to the Congress of Mexico in August will probably be ignored for the most part by the U.S. media. But whatever evolves from that, I think, will be moving forward one more step in the ratchet. I salute the administration of Peña Nieto, and you've made it clear that you think this makes sense, that it's not just the president, it's the president and his advisors. And I certainly hope that my optimism is justified this time, as it has been to a modest extent. And before I close this rambling discussion, which isn't a question, I'd remind everybody here that there are three monographs outside dealing with the potential for cooperation in renewable energy. We seem stuck on fossil fuels when we talk about Mexico in contexts like this. We shouldn't forget that there are opportunities for Mexico and the United States and Canada to move ahead in forms of renewable energy, which involves cooperation in electricity as well. Sorry to have taken up so much of your time, but you asked for it.
Thank you, Joe. That was incredibly valuable. Who would like to open the discussion here? One over here. Let's a couple of other questions while we're on the first round. Everybody's feeling shy at this point in the morning. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Good morning, and thank you for doing this. I'm Ruben Barrera with the Mexican news agency Notimex. And I would like to go to an area out of your field of expertise, which is the political side of this process. Mr. Marcos Jackman alluded the reform aspect, the labor aspect. And my question is, in light of what happened with the education reform, what the government decided to do with the Elbastel Gordillo, there has been a lot of talk about what made the government of Peña Nieto is preparing to confront the union of Pemex before this, before going ahead with this reform. And my question is, what do you sense in that regard? I mean, what do you expect the government will do in order to avoid any opposition from the union, which is still a very powerful union in Mexico. And I mean, how tricky you think that this will be, considering that the fight with the Baster Gordillo led to the separation of the teacher union going into the opposition? I mean, obviously the government is thinking about that possibility if, you know, they decide and go ahead and confront this powerful union.
Another question. Craig. And then next, Diana, behind you.
Yes, I'd like to know how you assess the approval in our Congress of the Transboundary Agreement, or, on the other hand, continued delay in approval on the debate on energy reform in Mexico, please.
Diana Negroponte.
Diana Negroponte, the Brookings Institution. I'm asking for clarity, please, from Mr. Marcos Giacoman regarding the slide that you had on the capex of 25 billion for 2013. I couldn't quite understand the consequences of investments and output in 2013, yet I know they're very important. Could we go back to that slide, please, and could you clarify?
Is this the slide, Diana, that you wanted to?
No. It's
Somewhere 2013 has deliberately been circled.
13. That's it.
Okay, why don't we go ahead and answer that round of questions?
Yep. Well, regarding the strategy of the government, I don't know really. But one thing I know, and the government should use it, in Sun Tzu, in The Art of War, said that one of the biggest strengths that you could have is to know your own weakness and the weakness of your adversary. And one of the huge advantages that the government has is that they already know what their adversary is going to do. Because no matter if they change just one comma of the Constitution, or they do a very dramatic and profound reform, the reaction from the adversary would be the same. So if you already know that the extremist positions in the Mexican left will you already know the speech, you already know the plot of the play, well, you could be much more strategical and much more ambitious, because I think now the biggest risk for the Mexican economy, it would be lack of ambition in the energy reform. If we don't act fast, if we don't see the global context, the biggest risk is that the world and Canada and the US would start conceiving the North American energy market. It's just formed by 2 of the 3 countries that form North America. That train is about to leave the station, and Mexico has to run fast to jump in. And the only way we can do it is through an ambitious energy reform. So if you already know that there's going to be, as it's the characteristic of our democracy, protest in the streets, and there would be blockades in the highways, no matter what you do, because in the 2008, we have a very mediocre reform with no ambition. It was a more bureaucratic reform. That's something that really want to change. They tried to push the furthest they could without changing the constitution. And now that we have proved that failed, and the biggest evidence of that is what Ernesto just showed, how the reserves are falling and how we don't have an energy sector. So if you already know what your enemy is going to do, well, embrace conflict and aim for the deepest reform that you could achieve, with 4 objectives: maximizing the profit and the benefit from the oil revenue to the Mexican state, how we could take more money from it. That should be the first big objective. The second one is, how could we guarantee energy for the whole Mexican industry? We are on the risk now. This process of U.S. companies bringing back manufacturing to the U.S. is in a response of cheap energy. That could happen in Mexico, but in the other way around. even all the competitive advantages that the Mexican economy has, we could lose a very relevant part of our industrial sector if we don't have access to affordable energy. So creating energy that guarantees the competitiveness of the whole economy, not just the energy sector. The country has paid a very high price in order to protect the inefficiencies of Pemex and Comisión Federal de Electricidad. There are factories that are exporting to the US, to the global markets, that have to stop their shifts because they don't have enough electricity to produce. That's today one of the biggest obstacles to the Mexican growth. Now, there was an article yesterday in the newspaper that it was bye-bye to Memo. Who's Memo? We use Memo as acronym from Guillermo in Mexico. Well, not Memo is the Mexican moment. He already left the building. And one of the reasons why is that the industry, which is the manufacturing export industry, which is one of the pillars of the economy, does not have energy guaranteed. And they have to have these cuts of production which break the whole chain of providers, and you cannot participate in the global manufacturing sector with this kind of trouble. That would be the second. The third objective is to create an energy sector which you have different companies offering different jobs to different engineers. If you are a young engineer studying at UNAM, working with Romero de Champs would be like your life goal achievement? I think not. We really have to create more options for young Mexican kids that want to study engineering. And the only way to do it is having a diverse ecosystem of different companies. And the fourth objective I just forgot, so I must pass the microphone to Ernesto. Yeah.
Okay. Perhaps to address the issue on this investment program, what I was trying to explain is that Pemex has its own business plan, and in that business plan, they announced several years ago that the beginning of Tula refinery would require this additional investment beginning in 2013. The Tula refinery has been announced, but it has not been approved in the sense that no appropriation of budget of capex has been approved, either by the government, because Pemex is subject to budgetary control as any other agency in the Mexican government, so it requires first authorization by the Ministry of Finance and then by Congress. And as you can see here, it is very very clear that they were asking for $7.5 billion for downstream investments. Perhaps we are lacking here the denomination. These blue columns are for downstream investment. The gray column is the EMP, exploration and production, upstream investment only. So what I was saying, that instead of $30 billion, Congress authorized 25 for this year, the budget that Pemex is exercising precisely this year. And 100% of the requirement for EMP was authorized, but only 1/3 of the projects in the downstream were approved, in terms of budget authorization. So again, I coincide with what Juan was saying. That is a bad investment, but the government has not announced that the project will not go through. They have announced that the project is going on, but nothing has happened, and I don't think nothing will happen until after the reform, to see if they can proceed with some version of a new refinery that would be justified if private investment is allowed, and they find a different way of developing this additional capacity. Now, going back to what Don Ruben Barrera asked about the labor union, all I was saying is that it is very important to address the issue of the labor union, because if you want to strengthen Pemex, if you want to to provide for a company operating as a national oil company, you need to renegotiate the whole contract, and that is being done. Every 2 years, the labor union contract is renewed. This year, they have to announce a new contract before I don't know if it's July or August. And there is one issue that they are already addressing, and that is the support, the financial support for the pension fund. Pemex has a liability on labor liabilities, the pension and other services like health services to the beneficiaries of Pemex. That is that now represents almost 2/3 of the total assets of Pemex, and it is not funded. There is a fund that only receives the flows of the year for the payment of pensions of that year. So, you know, if you want to put it very bluntly, almost 2/3 of all the assets that Pemex owns, refineries, wells, plants, petrochemicals, pipelines, is owned to the workers. It is a liability, a huge liability. So they are already negotiating a completely different pension system. Let's hope that they will increase the age of retirement, and they will start funding the pension fund. You need to have the liquidity if you want to address the issue, even in the very long term, you know, long run. So I think they are recognizing the issue. Of course, there is no public discussion about this. This is a discussion that is going on internally. And I agree with what you said about the example of El Bester Gordillo. If the government of Peña Nieto was able to do that with the strongest labor union leader in Latin America, we thought it was untouchable. She is now in jail, so I think it's the best example of the conviction of the government to fix these issues. And then about the U.S. Congress not being able to ratify the transborder hydrocarbon deal. I don't think it is perceived in Mexico as something negative. Of course, the Mexican Congress ratified the agreement a couple of months right after the signature. But it was also interpreted as a threat at that time, you know, that the government wanted to use the transborder concept and unitization of reservoirs to allow for international investment, international oil companies coming into Mexico to share, you know, in the exploitation of the resources. And since that has not happened, it took that argument away. You know, it is not that negative in this sense. But for deep water and for shale, as I think I showed in the graphs, most of the resources that we already have identified in deep water and in the shale place in the northern part of the country are right on the border. And I think you are right. We have to increase cooperation between the North American area if we want to really develop that to a significant degree. Let me just say one last thing about what Juan was mentioning. The revolution of oil and gas in North America, considering not only what's happening internally between Canada and the U.S., and the Keystone authorization that is also very important. We're watching that and waiting to see how this will integrate. Is of an enormous importance to Mexico. I would say that if you look at the facts, and that's what I try to show in these graphs. If you look at the trends today, the energy reform has to be a defensive strategy on the part of Mexico. If we don't do it, if we don't do a significant reform with constitutional amendments, then our competitiveness will be in peril. And I mean this literally, you know. The fact that we are not able to exploit the opportunity of low prices of gas, of natural gas, is already having a big effect in terms of competitiveness. There are companies in Mexico, Mexican investors building plants now in the US to be able to maintain competitiveness because they have access and very low prices of natural gas, and they also have much better tariffs, electricity tariffs. So if this is not done in Mexico now, our competitiveness in manufacturing, which is our strength today, will be in peril.
Thank you so much. Who else would like to come in? We've got a question here, and we'll take a couple from this side of the room first of all, if we can, then we'll come back to you. Go ahead, on the left here.
Ramon Sarduce, Western Hemisphere House Foreign Affairs. So I want to thank everyone for your presentations, and I just sort of, Duncan, in your presentation, in your remarks, you mentioned about sort of media attention that's given to this, and obviously in particular sort of international interest in sort of the possibility of the reforms coming through. Something and maybe sort of just a disconnect with myself sort of being over here, but found missing is a sense of what public sentiment is right now in Mexico, and sort of trying to find out if, as the discussions heat up and they go forward, I mean, how much is that going to play in the possibility of anything, if any of this coming through?
Thanks. Michael.
I don't know if this thing is on. Mike Macetic, I'm a little confused about the situation with engineers. I was at a session here yesterday where they were saying that Mexico is actually turning out more engineers from its universities, I don't know whether they meant per capita or in absolute numbers, than the United States is at the moment. And I'm just particularly interested in this issue because every session I go to about Latin America, whether it's Mexico or wider Latin America, they always talk about the biggest obstacle to economic development in Latin America coming up to competing with Asia, et cetera, is related to problems in education, whether you start at K through 12 or whether you go up to the university level, undergrad, postgrad. But specifically in this case, the issue about the availability and education of engineers in Mexico.
Thank you. Can we take a third question, if there is one? Over here, please.
Hi, Peter Bowman from the U.S. Department of Commerce. One of my questions is related to the timing of the Mexican reform. When do you see optimistically that something can be put together? And number two, following up on what Joe mentioned about renewable energy, understandably the focus has been on oil and gas, but I'd be curious to know, has there been any mention of renewable energy in the reforms? Because in these publications, for example, talk about some of the success stories, but also some of the obstacles to further deployment of renewable energy. And I'm wondering if maybe there would be more consensus among the parties to get something done in terms of renewable energy.
Thank you. And actually, we're going to take, there's one more question at the back that I think is Javier.
Javier Arreola, Brookings Institution too. This energetic reform brings like many stakeholders to, because many countries are very interested on what is Mexico doing. So I was wondering, the visit of President Xi of China brought some interesting things on energy and on the energy field. So some of them were really detailed, like the lending of $1 billion for Mexico investing in offshore equipment and ships. But also some of them were not like very concrete. So they just said cooperation, they just stated cooperation, but like other stakeholders like the Chinese petroleum company or Unipec are very interested in Mexico. So what would be your expectations on the cooperation of Mexico and China? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Juan, would you like to begin again?
Okay. Just as Ernesto was mentioning of the pension challenge that Pemex has, I'm going to share an anecdote. I don't want ever trash colleagues, so I will keep the name. I won't say it, but to do this work in IMCO, we hire some external consultants which are specialized on energy. One of them, it's a 48-year-old retiree from Pemex with 120% of his last salary. So I want a job like that, if you know. This was his first job after being retired, but how many retirees with 120% of the last salary could the country
48.
afford? At 48, yeah. And he looked perfectly healthy, and I'm good for him. So he's looking for a very successful post-career in his very early 50s. Once I heard President Calderon saying something, and it's relevant to the political part, very interesting, that said one thing is to win the presidency, and a second and very different one is to really get a grip and a hold on power, on political power. I think for Peña Nieto, the first real hold of power was what he did with Elbester Gordillo, and what would happen with Pemex, without speculating on the fortunes of the union leaders, would be his real kind of legacy, what we are debating here. And the timing should be the faster the better. One of the reasons that the Mexican moment fade away so fast is that a good part of Mexican private sector is withholding investment, expecting what will happen with fiscal reform and the energy reform. One figure that we have not put forward today, and it's a key figure for all this conversation, it's in average, in the last 10 years, 30% of government expenditure in Mexico has come from oil. As you say here that the US economy is addicted to oil, the Mexican public finances are addicted to oil. How we resolve that addiction would be another huge political conflict, because if we start to pay the taxes to cover that 30%, that will release Pemex from its liabilities and make it a more independent and autonomous company, that will not happen overnight. You cannot ask a society to start paying 30% extra taxes from one day to the other. You might, as the Greeks know, but it doesn't come easy from the political perspective. One positive sign is that 70% of the Mexican voters in July 2012 voted for candidates which supported reforming Pemex. The problem with this, that's the positive highlight. The kind of shade over this figure is that we just heard reforming Pemex, and we don't know what that means. We still have to see how the Mexican public is willing to digest the fact that we have the most backward energy sector in the world, and the process of adjustment would not be easy and would imply political conflict. And on the context of economic deceleration, it's going to make things a bit more complicated, but I think the government needs to embrace conflict. You cannot change a country like Mexico with certain degree of political conflict. I don't think, and I hope, that the Pacto would not survive through energy reform, because that would mean reducing it so it would become acceptable from all the parties involved. And if we keep the compass of ambition of a very revolutionary reform, which is made no out of decision or strategy, but out of need, as Ernesto was saying, we're in an emergency here. It's like learning to swim when the water is up to your neck. We don't have that many options to procrastinate on real reform. So the government has to embrace conflict. Regarding renewable energy, I think it's one of the sad parts of the shale revolution and the price affordability of energy in the US is that renewable energy was kind of sidelined. But my hope there is that the result of the shale revolution was a technological transformation. I hope that technological transformation in the renewable energy side would make it again more economic, affordable, viable. So and if you see the trend, it would be the source of energy with the fastest increase. The problem is that you come from a very, very tiny point. There's this way that governments have to lie with the statistics showing the increase of wind electricity, with electricity produced by wind during the Calderon government. And it is like 50,000%. Well, if you start from 1 watt, it's very easy to escalate. No, the challenge is the next steps. In the context where renewable energy, it's not necessarily the best value investment if you look at it from a very narrow and simple-minded perspective of profitability. But it should be part of the conversation. But sadly, it's not as it used to be a couple of years ago. Regarding China, I think the most important thing is that Mexico managed to reset and restart the conversation with China. We didn't have a conversation with China for 12 years. Someone that was in a meeting with a former Chinese head of state and President Fox told me that the biggest issue for President Fox on the meeting was when he was visiting China and the dates and when was the best weather to visit kind of conversation. That thing reset from, I think it was a kind of Control-Alt-Delete. Let's sit in the table and start talking again. If you look at the figures, it's really small. It's almost symbolic. 1 billion China loan, 1 billion is what the trade of Mexico and the US every 24 hours. We are sending 30,000 barrels of oil to China, which is a bit more than 1% of Mexicans' oil.
0.03.
0.03. It's a symbolic gesture. It's maybe a vote or a week, I don't know. But at least there's like a potential of increase. The figures are not relevant. The symbolism, it's much more important.
On this last issue, perhaps there is another perspective also for the relationship with China. The fact that we are beginning to export oil to China also reflects a conviction that perhaps the U.S. will not require that much oil from Mexico anymore. We are exporting less than 1 million barrels per day today. We used to export like 1.8 million barrels of oil to the U.S. refineries. And if Keystone Pipeline is authorized and you start getting the Western Canadian Select in the refineries in the Gulf of Mexico, at least we will suffer a significant competition in terms of our market, you know. I was following through some of these market conditions. The Western Canadian Select is selling in the last couple of years at around $35 below the Maya oil. So if Keystone is authorized and you have that kind of heavy sour oil similar to the Maya and get to the U.S. refineries, we might have to look for for a different market for our oil, you know. So I think it has this implication. We have to look more at the East because of this of what's happening in the U.S. and Canada and the integration between U.S. and Canada. Let me just give one more example because I think it's important for you to understand of why a light reform would not be of any service to Pemex. And I'm not going to talk about the 2008 reform, which left things much worse today than they were before 2008, the last reform. But I'm talking about the reform that Cedillo was able to make in 1995. In 1995, the regulatory law of Article 27 of the Constitution redefined the scope of the monopoly and left outside the monopoly the transportation, storage, and distribution of natural gas. So natural gas pipelines are legal to be made by private investors since 1995. That is 19 years ago. So what happened during all of this time and with all of what has happened in the natural gas market in North America? Mexico had around 15,000 kilometers of gas pipelines at that time, at the time of the reform. And today, it has like 1,500 more than at that time, while the transportation of natural gas and the consumption of natural gas has increased more than 2.3 times in Mexico in this same period. So that's why we have this lack of capacity to transport oil, the natural gas in this case, from the U.S. to the Mexican market. Nothing happened, although the law was amended at that time, and pipelines can be built and operated by private investors. And the reason is very simple. There is still a monopoly in the upstream. There is nobody else who can import or produce natural gas but Pemex. And there is also a monopsony on the other side. The largest consumer of natural gas is CFE, the power monopoly. So if you don't have a contract from one or the other, it's just impossible to justify a private investment in a natural gas pipeline. It just didn't happen in the last 18 years, and it won't happen until the reform is, allows for a free market to operate under those conditions. Perhaps one word about engineers. I'm not very sure about the figures, but I have an example that might be useful to understand an implication for the U.S. We have a client in our firm that provides ROV services, remotely operated vehicles, these vehicles for deep water operations. And when we started hiring Mexicans to operate as pilots of these ROVs, all of the candidates were engineers, certified engineers. And this was shocking for our American client, because all of their pilots in the U.S. are technical, mechanics or electricians or divers, that know how to operate this equipment. But in Mexico, they were all engineers, because we are really graduating many engineers. So they found an opportunity here, and they asked us to hire 3 pilots for each ROV operating in the country. And they trained all of these people. Today, we don't have operations in Mexico because of the way Pemex contracts out these services. It's difficult to explain, but the company is not active anymore. But all of the engineers that were trained as pilots of ROVs are already working for this company all over the world. Not in Mexico, but in the US and many other locations. So the implications for the US is, if you have lack of human resources, we can provide some of that if we are able to develop the sector as we have stated. And then one word about renewables. The reform of 2008 addressed that issue, and there is a special law to promote and regulate energy generated from renewable sources, but nothing really significant has happened except for eolic energy, wind energy. And that is because many Spanish companies that were suddenly left out of the market in their country and in Europe in general are in Mexico now, providing the opportunity that the law allows for self-consumption. They go and offer this to clients at a price, at a tariff that is below CFE's formal tariffs, and that's why this has developed, but not in a very significant way. Percentage-wise, it is dramatic, but starting from nothing, it is not really relevant yet. But I see a lot of opportunities to cooperate in the Rumorosa, in the Mexicali area in Baja California. There is an investor building an eolic farm to export all of this energy to California.
Thank you. Let me just make a couple of comments. One, on the engineers question. I think that Ernesto's comment, his response, really highlights the issue, which is that Mexico is graduating a lot of engineers, but it's not providing them with the opportunities. And as we all know, it's now a globalized labor marketplace. And so a lot of those people who are coming out are, yes, going to the United States. I remember a conversation I had about a year ago with the mayor of Sweetwater, Texas, which is a wind superpower. Actually generates more wind electricity in the town of Sweetwater, Texas than the entire country of Mexico. And I said, so what do you see are the possibilities of cooperation with Mexico on issues like this? It's great for us that we can go down there and recruit all of their engineers. And so, I mean, a lot of their recruiting takes place from northern Mexican universities. And that's something which will increase over time. The other problem, I think, is that because of the absence of real opportunities in the oil and gas sector, Mexico hasn't been graduating as many engineers in that specialization as they did before. And that's something which speaks directly to Juan's comment about, is it the dream of of your average Mexican graduate to go and work for the in the union? And I think that's something that really does need to be addressed. And it directly reflects the lack of a market, of an energy marketplace in Mexico. The opportunities just aren't there. One area on renewables that gives me some hope is that if you look at the growth, and it has been a dramatic growth, even though we began at a very small point, it's a dramatic growth that we've seen over the last 10 years or so on wind energy. That was all driven by the private sector. Thanks to the reforms of 1992, which allowed the private sector to become involved in certain kinds of generation, you actually created an opportunity there so that these companies that are generating wind electricity are not just selling to the national electricity company, they're selling directly, as Ernesto said, to private companies. So Cemex, Walmart, Grupo Bal, etc., they're all buying their wind energy directly from a private producer, a private generator, generally from Oaxaca. And we're seeing some of the same kind of things coming through right now in terms of the solar industry, which is minuscule in Mexico. And that's a ridiculous situation. It's absurd that Mexico is such a small solar producer because of the enormous potential that exists up in the northwest of the country in particular. But a new modification to the regulatory framework that's happened, which allows these small producers, 30 megawatts or less, not just to produce for sale on the open market, but also that the guarantees that they will get their electricity transmitted by CFE, and that CFE will have to buy all of their production as well if they want to sell it to them. That's a great opportunity at this point. The obstacle still is that if you have to sell to CFE, CFE doesn't guarantee you a price. CFE has to buy the lowest cost electricity available. And so even though it has to buy your electricity, it'll give you a flexible price with no floor on it. And that's a real challenge. If you are trying to plan out, 20, 30 years of solar generation, you want to know that you're going to get a good price for that electricity. And to speak to your question about public sentiment in Mexico, I think it's one of the questions that we've been talking about for the last 3-4 years. There aren't really any good polls out there that show us what Mexicans feel about the question of energy reform at this point. It's still quite divided in the country. My sense is, and I don't have any evidence to back this up, okay? But my sense is that there's been a significant softening over the past 4 years. But that could be a temporary phenomenon. And once the debate really begins in earnest, we'll see it becoming much more radicalized. But the reason why I say that is because if you look at going back to the end of 2011, once Peña Nieto started talking about the need for a reform of the energy sector, we all, I think, expected that as soon as he started talking about that, there would be a dramatic reaction, and there wasn't. And that's been the case all the way along. Every time that it's reported in the media that either the president himself or members of his cabinet are talking about this, and that perhaps the question of risk sharing, production sharing contracts are on the table, you haven't seen that dramatic reaction either from the other political elites or from the public in general. And one of my favorite photographs of the last 12 months that I have was taken in August, September of last year, when a poster appeared in my neighborhood in Mexico City of Lázaro Cárdenas standing in front of oil wells, and the lema was "Ahora te toca a ti," and he's pointing at you, kind of like Uncle Sam did, right? You know, and he's saying it's your turn now, meaning look, the privatization is coming. And I thought this was going to be the beginning of a wave of ads and propaganda against that, against privatization, supposed privatization, and it didn't happen. What we have seen, though, and we were talking about this just before the session, is that over the past month or so, the left-wing parties have actually started putting out radio ads. And radio is by far the most effective form of communication, I would say, in Mexico, just given the fact that most people spend hours of their day on, in their cars and stuck in traffic. Which is saying that, that we have to fight against the privatization. And I don't have any clear idea about how that message speaks to the general Mexican public. It speaks to a segment of it because it's been labeled as I think it's from the PT, the Workers' Party. So it speaks to their their target audience, but I don't think it speaks to a broader audience than that in general. But it's one of the major failings at this point in time of all of the opinion polling firms in Mexico, I'd say, is that we don't have any clear idea about this. The nearest I can get you is that there was a poll taken about 6 months ago, which asked people what they thought about the possibility of allowing non-Pemex gas stations to operate in Mexico. And a majority, not a strong majority, but around 60-65% of people said they thought that would be a good idea. Now, that's probably the most frequent visualization of Pemex and of, national oil that the Mexicans see on a daily basis. But it's also the area that they're probably least happy with, because as we all know, those of us who have lived in Mexico City, you spend a lot of your time not just stuck in traffic, but waiting to get to the gas pump because there's not enough gas stations out there. So we tend to blame Pemex for that. Ladies and gentlemen, we've come to the end of our time. Thank you very much for a very active and lively discussion. I hope to see you again here at the Wilson Center. Gentlemen, very well done. Thank you.
Now with ExxonMobil? Yes. Fine. Beautiful. Well, Exxon has a big presence there.